In 1941, the German Wehrmacht was convinced they were the masters of the earth. Their invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was guided by the world's most sophisticated military machine. They had the Krupp-engineered heavy artillery, the high-precision Zeiss optics, and the legendary Tiger tanks. To the German High Command, warfare was a science of precision. You calculated the trajectory, you aimed the barrel, and you destroyed a specific target. So when German scouts first spotted a new Soviet vehicle near the city of Orsha, they didn't even bother to report it as a threat. What they saw looked like a joke. It wasn't a tank. It wasn't even an armored car. It was a standard civilian-grade ZIS-6 cargo truck, the kind used to deliver milk or bread, with a crude set of 8 parallel steel rails bolted onto the back. It had no protection, no turret, and looked like it had been slapped together in a village blacksmith shop. The Germans laughed, calling it a mobile construction site. They assumed the Soviets had finally run out of real weapons and were resorting to desperate backyard engineering. But the Germans were about to learn a brutal lesson in the glitch of quantity. While Germany spent millions of Reichsmarks building a single perfect cannon that could hit a coin at 2 miles, the Soviet Union had realized a terrifying truth. You don't need to be accurate if you can destroy everything in the same zip code. The Soviets had been working in total secrecy on a project known only as Project 132. They had developed a rocket, the RS-132, that was notoriously unstable and impossible to aim. If you fired one, it might land a mile away from where you intended. To a German engineer, this was a failure. To a Soviet engineer, it was an opportunity. They realized that if you fired 48 of these rockets at the exact same time, their inaccuracy didn't matter. You weren't aiming at a tank, you were aiming at a coordinate. On July 14, 1941, the laughter stopped. A battery of only 7 of these trash trucks, under the command of Ivan Flerov, pulled up to a hill overlooking a vital railway junction held by the Germans. The junk weapons raised their rails toward the sky. The Germans didn't even take cover. They just watched. They had no idea that they were about to witness the birth of modern saturation warfare. The fuse was lit, and in a heartbeat, the delivery trucks were about to unleash a sound that would haunt the German army all the way back to Berlin. The moment Captain Flerov gave the command, the laws of 1940s warfare were rewritten in fire. In a span of just 7 to 10 seconds, the 7 trash trucks did something that an entire regiment of heavy artillery would take an hour to accomplish. They unleashed a relentless, rhythmic roar as rocket after rocket streaked off the rails. It wasn't a series of individual shots, it was a continuous, overlapping stream of white-hot steel. But it wasn't just the fire that paralyzed the German soldiers at the Orsha railway station, it was the sound. Unlike a traditional artillery shell that whistles through the air, these rockets were powered by solid fuel motors that created a low-frequency, terrifying howl as they tore through the atmosphere. It sounded like a massive mechanical pipe organ being played by a demon. This is why the Germans quickly gave it the name that would stick forever, Stalin's organ. To the men on the ground, it didn't sound like a weapon, it sounded like the atmosphere itself was screaming in pain. When the rockets hit, the result was a saturation glitch. Because the rockets were unguided and inherently unstable, they didn't land in a single spot. They blanketed a massive rectangular killing zone, turning the entire railway station into a sea of orange fire. Each rocket carried nearly 5 kilograms of high explosives, but their real power was the overpressure. When dozens of these warheads detonated simultaneously in a confined space, the shock waves overlapped, creating a vacuum effect that collapsed lungs and shattered concrete bunkers. Within seconds, the railway station, along with dozens of German supply trains and hundreds of elite troops, simply ceased to exist. There was no aiming, there was only erasing. But the real genius that made the Katyusha a masterpiece of Soviet engineering was its mobility. A traditional heavy cannon weighed several tons and required a team of horses or a tractor to move. Once it fired, it was a sitting duck for enemy planes. The Katyusha, however, was still just a truck. As the last rocket left the rails, the Soviet drivers simply shifted into gear and drove back into the deep forests of Russia. By the time the German Luftwaffe arrived to retaliate, the Stalin's organs were gone, leaving behind nothing but a smoking graveyard and a handful of survivors who were too traumatized to speak. The junk weapon had just committed the most efficient massacre in the history of the Eastern Front, and the Germans were about to realize that this wasn't just a battle, it was a psychological breakdown of the entire front line. By 1943, the Katyusha had evolved from a battlefield surprise into a psychological plague that haunted the German high command. The Soviet Union had leaned into the saturation blitz on a massive scale, manufacturing over 10,000 of these units and organizing them into entire divisions of rocket artillery. The German army, which prided itself on the discipline and stoicism of its soldiers, began to witness a phenomenon they had never seen before: typhoon of fire trauma. It wasn't just the physical destruction that broke them. It was the total helplessness. In a traditional artillery duel, you could hear the shells coming and dive for cover, but the Katyusha moved faster than a human could react. The screeching sound became a trigger for instant panic, and German veterans later reported that even the wind whistling through trees could send an entire platoon into a frantic scramble for the trenches. The Stalin's organ had become a psychological weapon that paralyzed the enemy's ability to think. Because the trucks were so cheap and easy to produce, the Soviets didn't care about losing them. They would drive them right up to the front lines, unleash a wall of fire, and if the truck was destroyed by return fire, they simply replaced it the next day. This created an image of an infinite, unstoppable force. By the time the Red Army reached the streets of Berlin, the Katyushas were being used as direct-fire weapons, leveling entire city blocks at point-blank range. The ultimate irony of the war was that the most technologically advanced army on Earth, with its V-2 rockets and Tiger tanks, was systematically dismantled by a wooden cab delivery truck with a row of metal pipes bolted to the back. The Katyusha proved that in a total war, perfection is the enemy of victory. It didn't need to be accurate, it didn't need to be pretty, and it didn't need to survive the battle. It only needed to make the enemy wish they had never stepped foot on Soviet soil. Stalin's junk truck had effectively ended the war by proving that quantity has a quality all its own, leaving the once mighty Wehrmacht buried under a mountain of cheap, screaming rockets.